So, as your handouts indicate, we are starting a series on the harmony of the Gospels, and that's what was requested. And I decided that we'll just go with the places where there's overlap. Anything that is covered by more than one Gospel, we will do those things, and I'll skip the rest. So first, I want to do a quick review of the Gospels themselves, and so talk about the authors, their approaches, why they wrote them, and so on, as much as we can tell. And I know you're all probably thinking, but I know all about the Gospels, and you are probably correct. But we're online, and so you never know who's going to run across these videos, and maybe they don't know. So, and who knows, you might learn something new. So what are the Gospels? The first four books of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They all tell the story of Jesus, his earthly ministry, his death, his resurrection, his ascension. There is considerable overlap, but there are differences between all of them in their approach. Now, one of them stands out as being very different from the others, and so much so that we actually came up with a term for the other three. They are the synoptic Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are a synopsis, somewhat chronological, of the ministry of Jesus from those three different perspectives. So John he's the one that really stands apart. It's more topical than chronological, and they're kind of like vignettes that have a theme to them. And so he wrote it for a very specific reason that's different from the others, I think. So, but I want to walk through all four of them, talk about the authors and what they did. So Matthew was a disciple, of course. He was formerly a tax collector in Rome. And if you think the IRS is unpopular in our culture, you should be glad we don't have Roman tax collectors. Roman tax collectors were assigned Roman soldiers to help them, if you know what I mean. And so they had the way the rules worked. So Rome did a census every now and then. And so it's through the census that they determined how much taxes were owed by this area. And so the tax collector had an amount, a specific amount. This is how much you need to collect and send to Rome. Now, the rules were you could do whatever you want to collect the taxes. We don't care. You could get it all from one guy. You could get it all from everybody, a little from everybody. It doesn't matter. And if you collect too much, keep the change. Seriously, that's how they were paid. They collected whatever was the minimum, and then whatever extra they got, they kept. And so, as you can imagine, they were not the most popular people in Israel. Now, Matthew's gospel is one of the greatest ironies in the New Testament, along with one other person, and I will explain. So Matthew was a Jew who worked for the Romans and collect taxes, and like all Jewish tax collectors, was generally considered to be a traitor to Israel, right? And it is ironic, therefore, that he wrote the gospel that presents Jesus as the Messiah, the son of David, and is written to Jews. So just think about that. And I say it's this one of two great ironies in the New Testament, because the other great irony is the Apostle Paul, who was the apostle to the Gentiles. And what was he? A Pharisee. And if you want to translate that into modern parlance, he was a super Jew, right? And so who does God send to preach the gospel to the Gentiles but the super Jew? And yet the traitorous tax collecting Matthew is the one that writes the gospel to the Jews. God's funny sometimes. But there's another interesting thing about Matthew. In his book, 12 Ordinary Men, John MacArthur goes over the disciples, and he says that they're kind of grouped. If you look at the way they show up in ministry, they're kind of grouped in like three groups of four. And the funniest part is Matthew is in the group with Simon the Zealot. Simon the Zealot, who was a revolutionary against Rome, was in the group with Matthew the tax collector. Anyway. That was for free. That wasn't in my notes. All right, Mark. Mark's gospel was written by Barnabas's cousin. I don't know if any of you knew that, but John Mark is Barnabas's cousin. And as his name suggests, he was a Hellenistic Jew, which means a Greek cultured Jew who probably was part of what they called the diaspora. It was apart from Israel. So he was one of the traveling companions of Paul. His gospel is the shortest, presents the general theme, if you're going to have a theme in it. He presents Jesus as the suffering servant kind of thing. Seems to be mostly targeted to the Romans, maybe, and maybe by extension other Gentiles. Very fast-paced. It's very short. Very fast-paced. It includes the word immediately over and over again. And immediately this happened. And then after that, immediately this happened. And so it's kind of this fast-paced, quickly from scene to scene. And some scholars suggest that that would have appealed to a Roman mind. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they said. Luke's gospel was another Hellenistic Jew, by the way, who was also a traveling companion of Paul on several journeys. Dr. Luke, right? He was from Antioch, which was probably the location of the first ever megachurch. Antioch was the first large church outside of the land of Israel. So, but that's where he was from. Luke is the longest and most detailed of all of the Gospels. He was a doctor, and so he's very detail-oriented, which would be a good trait for a doctor. It contains a lot of accounts that are not in any of the others. Now, all of them have some of that, but Luke has the most, where it kind of stands alone in a lot of the stuff that he writes. It seems to be a companion to the book of Acts, which was also written by Luke, and some people actually call them First Luke and Second Luke because they go together. And in fact, it has been suggested, and I think this is very compelling, that the two letters, so the Gospel and then the book of Acts, were written together to be part of a legal defense of Paul when he was in trial in Rome. And it makes total sense when you read it, thinking that, because whoever is, so they're both addressed to Theophilus. And in fact, in the book of Luke, it's that he's called Most Excellent Theophilus, which some scholars say could be an indication that he was a lawyer. So we don't know anything more about him. But both were written to this person, and it's giving you all of the background of Jesus in the first one, and then of Paul in the second one. And it's interesting because it ends with Paul going to his court date with Caesar, as it will. So it kind of makes sense, but we don't know for sure. So if Matthew is the gospel describing Jesus as the son of David, the Messiah, then Luke is describing him as the Son of Man. It's in his humanity. And so of the four Gospels, Luke really gives more of the human side of Christ than the others. And there's more details about his birth, more details about his death than any of the other Gospels. And that brings us to the odd duck, the Gospel of John. This is the same John that is the sons of thunder, James and John, who also wrote 3 eponymous epistles. Eponymous. I got to say eponymous today. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, as well as Revelation. Now, John was the last of the Gospels to be written sometime after 70 AD, they believe, so the temple has been destroyed and all of that. But John himself, though, became the leader in the church in Jerusalem. He was known as a prayer warrior. In fact, he was so well known for it that he got the nickname Old Camel Knees. Nice. Okay. John's gospel, though, not one of the synoptic gospels, so it's not, like I said, it gives us kind of vignettes that are more topical. And so if Matthew's presenting Jesus as the son of David, the Messiah, Luke is presenting the Son of Man, then John is presenting the Son of God. His theme is the deity of Christ. And it comes up over and over and over again. There's all the I am sayings. In fact, chapter 8 is kind of infamous for all of the Jesus saying I am over and over and over again. Yeah, so you have chapter 8 where he uses the phrase I am a whole bunch of times, and chapter 8 ends with him saying to the religious leaders, before Abraham was born, I am, and then they immediately picked up stones to kill him because they knew exactly what he was saying. And so, but the pinnacle of the book, at least according to some, is near the end in chapter 20 when Jesus appears to Thomas. You remember? What did Thomas say? My Lord and my God. It's the theme of the whole Gospel of John. And it fits all, and by the way, John is the only one that records that incident. And so you can see. Now, of the four books, John is my favorite and Matthew is a close second. And it's not that the others aren't great, don't get me wrong. But I really appreciate the deity part and the messiahship aspects of those two books more than the others, and you should too. Now, so let's start looking at some of the overlaps, and you have the handout here so you can see what the first one is. We're going to look at the genealogies of Christ, and Matthew and Luke both include his genealogies, but they're completely different, and they're in line with the intention of the authors in their writings. We all know that every human on earth goes back to Noah and his three sons and their wives, and that they went all the way back to Adam and Eve. But unless you've studied biology or anthropology, there's something you may not have thought about. So you have a father and a mother. Everybody has one of each. You have two grandfathers and two grandmothers. You have four great-grandfathers and four great-grandmothers, right? And every generation, it's a power of two. So 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, right? You see where I'm going with this? It's an ever-increasing number of ancestors. Well, if it's ever increasing, how can we all come from a common ancestor? Now I'm making you think. Obviously, at some point, somebody's marrying their cousin. That's how. And why am I bringing that up? Oh, by the way, does anybody know what Eleanor Roosevelt's maiden name was? It was Roosevelt. They were cousins. They were distant cousins, but just. The question that confronts us with the genealogies of Jesus, though, is why are they different? Well, they're the same when you get back to David, from there on back. And that's because somebody married his cousin. But it happens. It happens to all of us, by the way. So what we have here is one is Mary's genealogy, the other is Joseph's. And, like I said before, we all have one father and one mother, so we have two genealogies. But wait, I know you're all familiar with the Christmas lesson, so you know where this is going. But actually, that's a story for another time. I will give a quick synopsis of it here, though. Both genealogies pass through David, and so let's look at them real quick. Matthew 1. I'll read Matthew and then Luke, and then we'll talk. Well, I'll comment as we go. How about that? Matthew 1, the record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. Now, this is Matthew's. Remember, Matthew is presenting Jesus as Messiah, and he comes out of the gate. Chapter 1, verse 1, Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then he starts with Abraham, because it's the Jewish Messiah, so start with Abraham, whose father was Isaac, and he goes on Jacob, Judah, and so forth. And you get down to verse 6, Jesse was the father of David the king. David was the father of Solomon by Bathsheba, who had been the wife of Uriah. And he goes on, Solomon, father of Rehoboam, and continues. And then later on, in verse 11, we have Jeconiah. That's interesting. Zerubbabel, 13, is interesting. And then in verse 16, we have, and Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So what's interesting is you can see his purpose immediately is to present Jesus as the Messiah, and here's the proof. So here's the genealogy. And it goes back to Abraham. But you'll notice that it's the kingly line up until Jeconiah. And then everybody else in that genealogy from verse 12 on is in the line of the king, but none of them are kings. And that's because Jeconiah was cursed. For those who don't know my Christmas lesson, because of the curse of Jeconiah, anyone after him cannot reign as king. So it goes down to Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom was born Jesus, who was called the Messiah. So we're kind of leading the witness here. Luke says, when he began his ministry, Jesus himself was about 30 years of age, being, as it was supposed, the son of Joseph, the son of Eli. And then he continues on with that. But now, instead of going from from Abraham down. Now we start with Jesus and go up. But how far do we go up? Well, but you can see in verse 31 that the son of Nathan, the son of David. So Mary's side came through Nathan from David, and Joseph's side came through Solomon, the kingly. So that's basically, you put them together and you have the whole deal that we talked about in the Christmas lesson. That is the fact that because Jesus was essentially adopted by Joseph, then he retains the right to be he's a descendant of David through Mary, but he can sit on the throne through Joseph. And so problem solved. But it's interesting how his physical descendancy is in the Gospel of Luke, which is written to show us the Son of Man. His kingly descendancy to sit on the throne of David and be the Messiah is shown in Matthew, which is showing us the Messiah. It's interesting how they're true to form, basically, is what I'm saying. So let's move ahead to the birth of Jesus, and that's the next grid. Birth of Jesus. Matthew goes into considerably less detail than Luke. Matthew says, "And Joseph awoke from his sleep and did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, took Mary as his wife, but kept her a virgin until she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus." That's all the detail Matthew gives. By the way, the others don't even give us that much detail, because Mark and John don't even mention the birth. So there you go. Luke, however, says, "Now in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone was on his way to register for the census, each to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was with child. While they were there, the days were completed for her to give birth. She gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in clothes and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn." And that is a lot more detail on the birth of Jesus. You can see also how the things that are important to the authors that they want to get across are reflected in the accounts, because Matthew is just like, okay, yeah, he was born of Mary, he was a virgin, and that was it, and she did what the angel, she obeyed what the angel said, they named him right, and all that. But on the other hand, we have Luke giving the account of the census, everyone going back to their own city, and in the case of a descendant of David, that would be Bethlehem. And remember, this is Jesus as the Son of Man. It's emphasizing his humanity, and it's kind of making the point. I don't know that this was in Luke's mind when he wrote it, because remember, I think he's writing this as a kind of an amicus brief to a court trial that's coming up. But spiritually speaking, it's pointing out to us what John says in his first chapter, that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He pitched his tent among us. He was one of us. His genealogy goes back to Adam, right? It's stressing that fact. And look, there's even a census being taken, and he's going to be counted. He's one of us. It's that stress, which I think is really cool. Okay, and the last one, which is going to take the most time. Good, I still have enough time to do it. And I put from Egypt. Really, that's not really the point. The point is that how they got to Galilee and to Nazareth, right? And we know that they came out of Egypt to go to Nazareth. But here's these two parallel accounts. So Matthew 2:19 says, "But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, 'Get up, take the child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead.' So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee and came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets, 'He shall be called a Nazarene.'" Okay, that's Matthew's. Luke is much more straightforward. "When they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth." There's no Egypt. There's none of that. And so the point is, He's just giving the facts of, how Jesus ended up in Nazareth. Now, Joseph and Mary were living there before they went down for the census. They just went back home, essentially. So Luke only tells us that Nazareth, essentially, that this was Jesus' hometown, and that's really the only important part for Luke. Now, this one's interesting, though. Herod was going to have all the children 2 and under killed, and so Joseph and Mary were warned in a dream after the Magi left that they needed to go, and so they went down to Egypt, and that's great. Now, I should point out, though, Matthew makes repeated use of the phrase to fulfill what had been spoken, to fulfill what had been written, something along those lines. And since Matthew is presenting Jesus as the Messiah, he's going to present all of the prophecies of the Messiah and how they were fulfilled in Jesus, and he does that. And so, since he's doing all of that, fulfilled prophecy is critical here. But this chapter in Matthew, the whole chapter 2, points out a few examples of supposed prophecy, in quotes, that at face value are Old Testament references that don't predict a darn thing. And here you go. Earlier in Matthew 2, back in verse 13, it says this. Now when they had gone, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph, and this is the answer to your question, by the way, said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him." So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and while it was still night, and left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. That is, this was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." So that's supposedly a prophecy that was fulfilled by Jesus. Now, that prophecy is from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. And it says this, "When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." There's nothing predictive in that verse. And in fact, that verse, as Hosea wrote it, is not only not describing the future, it's clearly describing the past. And so by now you're wondering, rightly, well, how can Matthew then say that this was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet? But it gets even stranger. This actual passage that I put in the handout here, in verse 23, Matthew 2:23, it says, "This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene." If you have a New American Standard, then you might notice something strange in verse 23, and you actually all have the New American Standard because that's what I gave you. The New American Standard, like most English modern translations, give you clues about their translations in the text. And you all probably are familiar with when you see italics, it means those were words that were added for grammatical effect, they weren't in the original, right? And in fact, there's an example of that right in verse 23. It says, "This was," is in italics. It is so in your notes, I checked. So the original basically says, "to fulfill what was spoken." The "this was added to fix English grammar, just so you know. But that's not all. Another thing that the New American Standard does, and I don't know that any other translations do this exact thing, but the New American Standard does this, that when the New Testament in the New American Standard is quoting the Old Testament, it puts the quotation in all caps. Now, that verse that I read earlier from earlier in chapter 2, where it says, "Out of Egypt I called my son," that's in all caps in the New American Standard. This particular prophecy is not in all caps, right? And it's in quotation marks, indicating that it is a quotation, but it is not in all caps, indicating that there's no reference in the Old Testament for this. So if there's no reference in the Old Testament for this, and it's not in all caps, how could it be fulfilling something? Okay, this is truly strange. Well, what does it all mean? It actually brings up an important aspect of biblical prophecy that we don't really, it's not obvious to us, and you don't ever hear it taught on very much. Not all things that we call prophecy are strictly predictive, right? There are different kinds of prophecy in the Old Testament. Even earlier in Matthew chapter 2, we have a great example of a truly predictive prophecy. This is 2:5 and 6. So it says, "And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet, And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. That is a quote out of Micah. Micah gave a clear, predictive prophecy that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Great. That's predictive. That's something we can look forward to. And it was fulfilled by Jesus because he was born in Bethlehem. And this is kind of the point of Matthew, right? Plain predictive prophecy. And that's what we think of when we think of prophecy, but there's another kind of prophecy that's more nuanced. We've talked about biblical types before, where in the Old Testament you have something, an incident, a person, a place, a thing, something happened, some event, and it prefigures something that would happen again in a different context. So a good example, the best example I could think of is Joseph. Joseph is a type of Christ. He's the suffering servant, right? And so he becomes a prefiguring of the suffering that Jesus would go through in that sense. So that is a fulfillment of a prefigured prophecy in Joseph's life. Anyhow, you get my point. So Micah very clearly said the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. That's predictive. When Matthew says, out of Egypt I called my son, and he says it was fulfilled, it is fulfilled, but it's not predictive. It's prefigured. It's prefigured in the nation of Israel as they came out of Egypt as slaves, right? And what's interesting about these prefigured kind of prophecies is you don't know that they're there until they're fulfilled. Because otherwise it's the story. Oh, look, the story repeated over here. Well, then that became a prefigured prophecy that was fulfilled. A couple of my favorites, and I've mentioned them before, the tablets of the law that Moses brought down from the mountain, and he broke them. And he goes up and he gets another tablets of the law, and he brings them down, and they put them in the ark. The rock they go to for water, the first one he strikes it. They go to a rock a second time. He's supposed to speak to it. He doesn't. He strikes it, but that was wrong. He was supposed to speak to it. It's the same pattern. It's the first and second coming of Christ. Broken, and then he comes in a second time. It's really cool. Again, these are types. These are types that are fulfilled. Now, but what about, okay, so that's out of Egypt I called my son. That was fulfilled. We get that. Now, what about verse 23 here? He shall be called a Nazarene. That doesn't even have an Old Testament reference. Well, actually it does, but it's hard to explain just in a translation. So you would need to be familiar with both Hebrew and Greek, since this was written in Greek. But if you were familiar with Hebrew, then you would get what Matthew's trying to say here. Since Matthew's writing to convince Jews of their Messiah, I think he assumes that the readers would be familiar with Hebrew, which is reasonable. The name of the town in Nazareth, right, is related to the Hebrew word for branch. And actually, the prophet Isaiah, some of you are already tracking with me. The prophet Isaiah 11:1, then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. And so Nazareth literally means branch. And so Jesus would be called a Nazarene. Now I want you to think about something. We talk about fulfilled prophecies. Just talk about predictive prophecies for a second. People, think, well, not all prophecies have to be fulfilled literally. For example, think about how people before Christ was born would react to the virgin will be with child and will give birth and all that from Isaiah, right? Well, clearly that's not going to be fulfilled literally, right? And so we look at predictive prophecies and we say, well, that can't be literal, and yet they always are. I mean, it's fascinating. Do a study sometime and think about how would this be thought to be fulfilled. It seems impossible. Look at the whole Jeconiah thing. How can David's son reign on the throne after Jeconiah? It clearly has to be symbolic. Think about this, and this is such a great example of this. We so want to go to fulfilled prophecies and say they don't have to be literal. But Jesus was referred to in prophecy as the branch. Who's going to call him the branch? But they called him a Nazarene, which means the branch. It was literally fulfilled. Isn't that crazy? And so, anyhow. But so like as we go through in the coming weeks. The rest of these parallels between the Gospels. What do we take away from this? Well, first is we get to walk through some things in chronological order, which I think is cool. We get to see the different emphasis each author puts into why they shared what they shared, and that's cool. But this last thing, and this kind of ties in with the two prophecies I just shared, skeptics like to poke holes in the veracity of Scripture by showing supposed contradictions between the Gospels. And things like what I said here about the Nazarene. That wasn't a prophecy. What are they talking about? Or the one from the other one coming from Egypt. It's a prefigured instead of predictive. So I think by walking through the Gospels and looking at these things in parallel, hopefully we can put to rest some of those, spicy claims by the skeptics.